Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Kanti and I work as a product manager here at Exxat, and I welcome you all for today's webinar on Student and Clinical Instructor Assessment Tool, short form SCIPAI tool. And our presenter for today is Sean Gullivan, Director of Clinical Education, University of Dayton. Before we go into the webinar, I just want to go over some of the housekeeping things. Okay, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please add them to the question section, and Kunal and I will be monitoring the question section periodically. As usual, feel free to download today's presentation from the handout section, and you can use it to follow along, or you can keep it as a reference for future. This webinar will be recorded and shared with you through email 1 hour after the webinar ends, and we will also make it available on our YouTube channel. We are going to give everyone a few more minutes to log in and get their audio sorted. So we'll be back with you in just a few moments. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We also have with us today Kunal Vaishnav, our CEO at Exxat, and he will give some context about the tool, and he will introduce our presenter for today. Kunal, over to you.
Perfect. Kanti, thank you for the introductions. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I'm thrilled to be presenting along with Sean the SCIPAI tool. So just in terms of some little bit of a context, we started this summer webinar series in April, where we first had a discussion of some of the evaluation instruments available for PT programs in the nation. We started with the CIET tool. Presentation was done in April. We had a presentation in June for the PT Max, the Blue Max, as the tool was called, and the Texas Consortium. And today, I'm thrilled to have Sean come and present the SCIPAI tool. I think most of you already know Sean through his deep association with APTA, but just a little bit of an introduction on Sean. Sean is a veteran clinician and a clinical educator. He has participated in about 16 years of clinicals as a CI or as an SCCE, and the 13 years of that as a director of clinical education too. As an SCCE for 10 years at the Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, Sean provided annual clinical education development opportunities for CIs, SCCEs, DCEs, and hospital administrators. Opportunities for areas CIs to become APTA credentialed, and other cross-institutional collaborations, such as development of a weekly student and a CI feedback form. As the DCE at University of Dayton for the past 13 years, Sean continues collaborative efforts to improve clinical education, including service on an Academy of Education Research Committee, as an on-site reviewer for the Committee on the Accreditation of Physical Therapy Education, CAPTE, as a developer of the Student and Clinical Instructor Performance Assessment Instrument, SCIPAI, that we are covering in the webinar today, and as a clinical education researcher. Sean's research efforts focuses on performance assessment tools for students and instructors in clinical settings, communication and feedback in clinical education, and needs of the clinical educators. We are thrilled that Sean has collaborated with Exxat to complete 3 separate research studies, including the reliability and the validity assessments of the APTA PTSE and the Student and Clinical Instructor Performance Assessment Instrument, which is the focus of today's webinar. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sean Gullivan, and Sean, please take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Kunal. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you, Kanti and Kunal, both for all your logistical support for making the series of webinars available, and certainly for this particular one. As noted in the introduction, University of Dayton DPT and Exxat have collaborated on the 3 different research studies on assessment tools. I can't tell you how grateful I am to Exxat for their support of our profession in this manner. Their development of their educational platform provides us with a national database that is absolutely ripe for clinical education, PT, educational research, and they support such research. As well, thanks to Exxat for their role in the development and accessibility of the student and clinical instructor performance assessment instrument. Finally, thanks to each of you for participating today, because we are all ramping up for the start of the new school year, which is for most of us about a week away. So really appreciate the time you're taking today, and I plan on making it worthwhile for you. So we're going to talk about a few different things in regards to the SCIPAI, but I'll start out by just giving a brief, here's what it is. Here's some of the basics of what's included in the content. Then I'll jump into, well, what was the need for it? Why are we using this tool in our program? We'll go through the history of the development of the tool and our efforts to understand the tool's validity before giving you the user experience, so that the workflow that the student, the clinical instructor, the site coordinator, and the DCE would have when using the SCIPAI. And then some of the user experience from the standpoint of, do we like the tool? Is it easy to use? Is it technically accessible? Those types of things before opening up to questions and answers. At the end of each section, I'll plan on just asking if you have any questions, or have a cue Kunal on that as he'll be checking the question and answer chat box. But it's likely that many questions I'll answer by saying, hey, hang on, we're going to cover that in the next section. Great cue. Finally, I'll just say that this is about 65 to 70 minutes of content. So that should leave us, a good 15 minutes or more for question and answer throughout and at the end of the presentation. So I'll start out just by talking about this performance assessment instrument. The first thing I want to say is we call this the SCIPAI. That's the acronym for Student and Clinical Instructor Performance Assessment Instrument. And our students and I think it's just a fun thing to say, SCIPAI. So, you're all muted. So if you want to just say that every now and then throughout the presentation, no one will ever know, and you will get the joy of having said it. So first of all, it's a formative tool. So we know we have formative tools, summative tools. Our summative tools are more of our high stakes tools that we use at the midpoint and endpoint of clinical. So we've used the CIET, the CPI, the PT Max, at least somewhat in that summative manner. On the other hand, many of us probably have some type of weekly feedback form we've used to provide a formative role. So this is more of a structured formative tool that you will be able to use throughout a clinical for performance snapshots. So it's not as thorough, it's not as complete as the summative tools that I've already mentioned, but it gives us this snapshot to tell us how is this clinical going, and to create a dialogue between the student and the CI. As both student and CI performance are being assessed and discussed. And they're being assessed and discussed by both the self, so the student or the CI, and the other, depending on whose assessment is being performance. One of the things I'll note is that clinical instructors had been asking us for years for feedback during a clinical so that they can improve their instruction during a clinical. Because oftentimes it might be 6 months or a year before a CI has another student to implement whatever suggestions there have been made on improvement. So it has the benefits of both a rating scale and supporting comments, and all of us are familiar with that type of approach on assessment tools. It has demonstrated construct and concurrent validity, and we'll talk about that later. It's readily accessible, and certainly to the student in CI, because that's who has to use it. But the neat thing is completed SCIPAIs are readily accessible to me as the DCE, and they're readily accessible to the site coordinator. So we have multiple points or snapshots, windows into how this clinical is going throughout the clinical. And then certainly with it being on a common database and nationally available, it just provides abundant research potential, which I think has been a real need in our profession for many years. This slide just gives us an image of some of the information I've already shared, but it's really looking at the SCIPAI as part of a comprehensive assessment plan, in this case for student performance. And you see I've mentioned the summative tools, PT Max, CIET, and CPI, that are at least used in a summative manner somewhat. I think some of those we could argue could be used in a formative way as well. But the SCIPAI is intended to be a formative tool that's used at multiple points throughout the clinical in conjunction with whatever summative tool that we use. And at UD, we use the CPI, so you may hear me reference that a few more times than the others. So this is the same image, only in regards to clinical instructor performance. So again, having a comprehensive plan. And you'll note that the PTSE is identified as the summative tool referenced. And there's a little note on there that highlights that back in last December, JOPTE, a research article identified that the construct validity was not able to be substantiated with the PTSE, and the internal consistency was suspect. So we at UD no longer use that tool based on that evidence. There are many schools that still use it, but the SCIPAI, again, whether you're using it or not, provides a valid tool that can be used as well. The other tool that's mentioned up here, the Clinical Teaching Effectiveness Questionnaire, that is a self-assessment tool. Wormley and her group, they went ahead and took the objectives from the Clinical Instructor Credentialing Program and modeled this assessment tool after that. It can be used at any point. It's not necessarily designed to be used during a clinical for improvement within a clinical, although it could be used in that manner. It's really at any point in my career as a clinical instructor, how am I doing in the instruction of my students, my effectiveness? So as far as content in the SCIPAI, we've got both CI and student performance measures. And we'll just look at the top half here initially. For CI performance, we assess supervision and feedback. And for student performance, evaluation, treatment, communication, and professional behavior. The scale that's used is a 0 to 100 scale, and we're asked the students in the CIs identify the percentage of time that the student or CI manages effectively without needing cues. We went to this 100-point scale at the request of the students, in part because a 0 to 5 scale was not discriminating between better and worse clinical instructors or better and worse performing students. There tended to be a ceiling effect. And the students said, we're used to being graded from 0 to 100 since we were in kindergarten. So against prevailing wisdom in the literature, we went with the scale. And certainly that begs the question of validity assessment if you're using a scale that's not currently being championed. So kudos from this week. Those next two rows, kudos from this week, that's praises. What went well this week? So students and CIs will offer textual comments for that, as well as for goals for the upcoming week. And then finally, the student performance assessment closes out with a measure of independence with the caseload. So for simple cases, complex cases, and the overall caseload. And this would be, another way to say this is how many of your patients is the student independent with compared to the total number of cases with simple, complex, and the overall caseload. This actually is helpful in the sense that it feeds into the summative tool assessment. So for the CPI, the now 12 items, and for the CIET and the PT Max, more the global rating or similar overview assessment score that one might give a student. So any questions at this point? Okay, not hearing any. Or not getting a cue from Kunal that there's anything in the chat box. I'll go ahead and just highlight, well, what's the purpose? You know, why should we be using this tool? Why does UD use this tool? And certainly we have,
sorry
yeah.
to interrupt. There is a
Yep.
question from Melissa. Is this
Go
tool in Exxat currently? Oh, I think she took away that question. Okay. Yeah, I think, okay. And there is one more question from Lindsay. Is this tool for PTs only or PTs and PTAs?
Yeah, so it was designed for PTs. So it has the evaluation assessment that would be for PTs and not PTAs. But that particular thing could just be ignored, and it could very easily be adapted and used for PTAs as well as other professions. That, you know, the items, the constructs being measured are fairly generic across health professions. Great, thank you for that. So we have both internal and external motivators for using a particular tool. And certainly CAPTE tells us, as far as student performance, that we need to have a variety of effective tests and measures. And I highlighted how we use the SCIPAI as part of our comprehensive assessment plan. CAPTE also highlights to have regular evaluation of student performance, and certainly we have multiple points throughout the clinical. CAPTE does not regulate how many, they don't define what regular is. So certainly past CAPTE reviews have told us if we just have a midpoint and final clinical and demonstrate how that's being useful, we're fine. We've added to that with regular points of contact throughout the clinical. And then down at the bottom, the final bullet point, how does the program ensure students have achieved the objectives? And again, you can do that with the summative tool, but we are assessing that throughout the clinical. Are we meeting the objectives? Are we on track to meet the objectives of the clinical? Similarly for faculty assessment. So, you know, we have to have some measure of assessing clinical teaching effectiveness. And we have to identify how these expectations are monitored. And again, I just have found great benefit to have in real-time access to assessments of both our students and our clinical faculty during the clinical. And thus I'm able to use that information to summarize the teaching effectiveness per the CAPTE standard. Additionally, and this is both internal and external, something was missing. You know, we knew our profession, you know, really lacked formative tools that were used nationally to assess and guide student and clinical instructor performance throughout clinicals that occurred at points other than midpoint and endpoint, because we found that if we wait till midpoint to understand how our students are doing, we've often missed the window of opportunity already to intervene as concerns are then identified in the second half of the clinical. It includes rating scales, you know, tools with rating scales that are formative throughout the clinical were not part of the picture. And certainly I was not aware of any reliable and valid formative tools for use throughout a clinical. I talked about the easy accessibility and the advantage for both DCEs and site coordinators in that regard. And then again, this is really the big point. And this was really the internal motivators, this early identification and resolution of issues. I have found that we are creating a culture of professional conversation, the ability of our students to engage in more critical conversations, of their own performance and others' performance. In this case, the CI, someone who happens to be their supervisor. And what that has done is that's really encouraged students not just to have those conversations, but to reach out to us earlier in the clinical for problem resolution and action, and sometimes just for consultation. Hey, Dr. Gallivan, I just have a question on how to best word this concern that I have my clinical instructor, because both student and CI know that once a week or every few weeks, they're going to be talking to each other about performance. And the CI is going to be saying, hey, is my supervision and feedback okay? And if a student says, well, no, it's not, sometimes they need help with the words and they reach out for that. So I really appreciate just the culture of conversation this has created in a very professional manner for our students. Okay, this is kind of a more lighthearted. I've given some of this information internally at UD to non-physical therapy educators. So this acronym salad that they get is overwhelming. So the first two paragraphs are really just highlighting, when there's issues, there's dialogue between students and CIs. But the final paragraph, I think, kind of fits in well with why we use the SCIPAI. Fortunately, the SCIPAI is now available to assist the student and CI in the early identification of concerns that allow for performance improvement before needing to consult the site coordinator or the DCE and avoiding poor scores on the midterm or final CPI, CIET, or PT Max. So that concludes kind of the what is it and the why. Why do we use it? I'd like to jump in and talk about how this was developed and what kind of assessments we've had from a validity and other research study standpoint. Any questions before I do that?
Yes, Sean. Heather had a question.
Yes.
Question was a fact that given that the tool includes kudos and goals for the following week, I assume this could replace the PTSE and any weekly planning form a program was utilizing.
Yes, and indeed that's what we've done. We no longer use the PTSE, and this would replace a weekly form. On our shorter clinicals that are 7 or 8 weeks, we use it every week but the first and last week of the clinical. On our 12-week clinicals, we use it at weeks 2 and 4. Then we have a midterm assessment using the CPI. We use the SCIPAI again at weeks 8 and 10 before the final assessment with the CPI in week 12.
Perfect. Thank you. A few more questions, Sean.
Yes.
One coming from Dr. Elizabeth Chaffin. Her question is, does this replace the progress notes for CAPT?
Does this replace the progress notes for CAPT? I'm not sure what you're referencing as far as the progress notes.
I can unmute Elizabeth and maybe she can ask her question. Elizabeth, yeah. I'm going to mute you. You can click on your microphone icon to unmute yourself. Elizabeth, ask a question.
Okay. Sorry, thank you. I think you answered it just before, is that I know we don't have to have necessarily progress notes, but that's what a lot of us use in order to do that assessment every few weeks and, like you said, set goals and so forth. So I think you answered this just before.
Okay, excellent.
That this is replacing that assessment that we need to do every few weeks.
Yeah.
Either every week or every couple weeks, whichever way we choose to do it, just to assess throughout the rotation.
Yeah, and with my CAPT reviewer hat on, I would just say that, there's no prescription by CAPT how you do it, but you need to be able to justify what you're doing and that it's effective. Putting my DCE hat on, being reviewed by CAPT 2018 or 2019, so we were using the tool at that time. It was very easily to demonstrate that we were monitoring the situation and we were able to show students were progressing toward goals and clinical instructors were getting feedback that they needed as well.
Okay. And it covers, because, it covers the domains, obviously, that they want us to keep. We set up the progress note saying, here's the domains we're looking at, and, we want, how did it go these 2 weeks? what are your goals? Did you meet your goals? What are your goals for the next week? And I know I'm being a little bit general about that, but this does hit those domains that CAPTI wants us to see. I mean, it looks like it does, but just to confirm with you, this will work for that.
Yeah, and again, CAPTI is not that prescriptive as far as do you need to assess evaluation versus treatment versus communication. You know, we choose those, but you know, when we share that information with CAPTI, we have to be able to demonstrate that we have a comprehensive understanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Appreciate the question. I'm going to mute you now. One more question from Dr. Emily Hawkins. Were weekly planning forms not meeting the needs?
So you will see in just a moment that we weren't using weekly feedback forms at Miami Valley Hospital when this was first developed, when the initial version was developed. So it does replace for us, or it does provide for us, a weekly feedback form. As I mentioned, on our longer clinicals, we found that we just didn't need to use it every week. So we wanted to lighten the load of our students and clinical instructors and space it out a little more, and found that to be effective for our purposes.
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. And one last question is from Dr. Sheena Long. If we are interested in this tool, may I pilot this with 1 to 5 students and CIs before making it a part of clinical education experience?
Yeah, and I'll leave the, Kunal, I'll let you answer that from a technical standpoint. Certainly,
yes, absolutely. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. The answer is yes, Sheena, absolutely. Not an
Yeah.
issue at all. If you are interested, post the webinar, reach out to Sean and Exxat, and we can work on getting you set up for the pilot. Perfect. No more questions. We can move on, Sean.
All right. So as I mentioned, I was at Miami Valley Hospital, and we had a year where we had 5 of 24 clinical education experiences require significant site coordinator and DC interventions. And as you know, one issue is a heavy lift if it's a really involved issue, and each of these were, and that was incredibly fatiguing and stressful on not just the CIs, but all their coworkers too, who are having to try to support the clinical instructors at this site, and certainly for the student, they were tough. So this was something where our staff said, we cannot do this anymore. We need to do something differently. The big issue that was coming up, I highlighted earlier, is just that we weren't aware of problematic issues, me as the site coordinator and then the school's DCEs, until later in the clinical. So we wanted to somehow address, can we earlier in the clinical uncover any concerns that might be developing into issues and address them before they become more complex issues. So our CIs suggested a weekly feedback form to help identify these issues earlier and allow more time to address them. So amongst the CIs, we developed what we thought were good things to assess, content to include. We consulted with other Ohio hospital-based clinical sites and Ohio and Kentucky DCEs regarding the content. I think we didn't really know it at the time, but I think we can claim content validity based on the multiple layers of efforts and trying to get input and assess the content that we eventually went forward with. So as I mentioned earlier, we measured clinical instructor performance, supervision, and feedback, and then for students, evaluation, treatment, communication, and professional behavior. You can see that initially we were using a 0 to 5 scale, and that's where I found we just didn't have enough spread to understand who was performing where they needed to be, or certainly for our clinical instructors, where the ceiling effect was much more dramatic than with our students. So that was, again, initially the scale. We had strengths and weaknesses, progress toward goals, and goals for next week as kind of our open-ended questions. And initially, we actually didn't have clinical instructors performing a self-assessment. So we implemented that tool at Miami Valley, and the following year in 2005, we only had 1 of 22 students have issues. And so we did have other interventions, so I can't claim there was a cause and effect, but at least there was a coinciding phenomenon. That phenomenon was strong enough that we said, we are definitely going to continue using this tool because we really felt it was helping us with earlier understanding of how progress is going with our students and CIs. And the CIs really enjoyed having it. The students liked having a track record of their progress throughout a clinical. And that was something we weren't expecting. So we were pleased that the students found it helpful in that manner. When I moved to UD in 2010 as DCE, we took the tool and the development of the tool with us, and had a number of both developmental events that I'll highlight as well as research studies. So the first thing we did was we wanted to do a comparison study trying to understand that based on your use of a combination or standalone of the CPI, the SCIPAI, and the SCIPAI, would the outcomes change? And that outcome being the final scores on the CPI. So the first group only used the CPI at midterm. The second group only used the SCIPAI throughout the clinical, had no midterm CPI. And then the third group used all of the above. What we found was that use of either the regular weekly feedback forms throughout the clinical or a single midterm CPI achieved similar CPI scores at the end of the clinical on our shorter clinicals. We weren't brave enough to try this on our longer clinicals at that time to not use a midterm CPI. But I know other schools have actually done that. But I don't have hard evidence to attest to that. The other thing that we identified was that if you use both the regular feedback forms and the midterm, there is an advantage on professional practice items on the CPI and shorter clinicals. There was a significant bump, and on patient management skills on longer clinicals, there was a bump, and there was a bump on safety on all clinicals. But as we looked at that bump was not from poor performing to high performing. It was more from pretty good performance to a little better performance. So we didn't feel it was a value to have our students and our clinical instructors have the burden and time needed to do both for what we considered was a small benefit. So we made the decision, we're going to use the SCIPAI because we like the multiple points of contact throughout the clinical, that we get those snapshots. We feel the students and CIs can see things earlier, discuss concerns earlier. And so that was our path forward. And as you can imagine, both students and CPIs, you might have heard them actually. It was probably back in about 2015 or so. Our students and CIs started yelling with joy because they didn't have to fill out the midterm CPI, which, as you know, for those of you that use it, could be on average a 2-hour investment, but for some a 3 to 4 hour investment of time. So in 2016, we added the CI self-assessment to the tool. And also that was when we changed the rating scale from a 0 to 100 scale. We also went online with a web-based app, and this made for, actually, you can see that visually, just a very easy side-by-side comparison of student NCI rating clinical instructor performance, and then student NCI with rating student performance. And I really enjoyed this from the standpoint of now I had an electronic real-time window into student performance, NCI performance. And that's when we renamed it the SCIPAI as well. So certainly all these changes beg a validity assessment of the tool. And so we did that initially with internal data. So 144 student NCI pairs across our 4 clinicals. So one full-time first clinical, 2 intermediate and 1 terminal clinical. We assessed concurrent validity and construct validity. So concurrency was with a gold standard where we're correlating, similar items on the SCIPAI with, in this case, the gold standard being the CPI. Now, some of you might be laughing and saying that can't be the gold standard. However, in a systematic review done by O'Connor and his group out of Ireland in 2019, they identified the CPI as one of the most psychometrically sound and easy to use tools that were out there amongst all the tools they could get their hands on internationally. So anyways, that gave me some, a solid foundation for, let's use this as the gold standard because it does have some demonstrated validity. And when we did that, we found that there was a strong relationship between similar SCIPAI and CPI measures of student performance. For construct validity, we looked at progression of scores, first between initial and final SCIPAI measures. And we found that for student and CI performance, there was a significant progression of scores between first and final, let me back up a second. For within a clinical, when you look at measures at the beginning of the clinical to the end of the clinical, there was a progression of scores for both student and CI. And then across clinicals, we saw that progression for students. We did not compare CI performance across clinicals, for reasons you can imagine. We moved to Exxat in 2020. Those bullets again highlight some of the things that were really appealing at the time and have certainly played out for us well. And then did a regional assessment. So we used 8 institutions from Ohio and Kentucky, 21 clinical education experiences involving 811 student and CI pairs were involved in this study. We had each student and CI pair complete at least 4 SCIPAIs, 2 before the midpoint and 2 after the midpoint were the minimum. And for clinicals of 6 to 12 weeks in duration. Each student and CI pair completed at least a final CPI. So for CI performance, we found when CIs were doing the assessment of their own performance, supervision, feedback, and a sum of those 2 scores all improved significantly from initial to final SCIPAI within a clinical. When students rated the CI, feedback and sum of scores improved significantly from initial to final SCIPAI. When we looked at student performance, both student self-assessment and CI ratings of the student showed all items improve significantly from initial to final. So we can say there's evidence of progression by progression of scores for some construct validity. And then we looked for progression of scores across clinicals regarding student performance. And when the CIs were doing the assessing, evaluation, treatment, communication, and sum of scores all showed significant improvements from earlier clinical education experiences to later clinical education experiences, and that there was no change in professional behavior. And in looking at those scores, it seemed clear that that's because they started out so highly rated, for which we are grateful. Student self-assessment, so similar, only there was no change in communication as well. So, but with, so progression of scores across clinicals also contributed to construct validity. And then concurrent validity, just as with our pilot study, we compared or correlated like items on the SCIPAI and CPI. And when the student was assessing, when the clinical instructor was assessing student performance, evaluation, treatment, communication, and sum of scores each had a medium correlation, whereas professional behavior did not. And student self-assessment, again, similar, only as we saw previously, communication also had no correlation. Okay, so that was a lot, kind of the fast blast at the research studies. I will be sharing the the full description of that final research study at ELC. So we can dive a little more deeper into that at that time, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on any of that content at this point.
Perfect. There was one question from Laurie, Sean.
Yes.
Do you find students are hesitant to give CI feedback and not necessarily be open and honest with their feedback to the CI?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a learning curve. So our first years on their first clinical are much more hesitant in giving that feedback. By the time they're on their third or fourth clinical, it's just it's an expectation, and they've grown in their ability to speak up for themselves when they don't appreciate how much some components of their supervision, CI supervision or feedback. And it's really, and I'll highlight in some of the user experience slides, just some of the content and feedback they've given in regards to that comfort and a willingness to reach out when they have concerns. But it definitely is a cultural shift, and our students are growing in that throughout the course of their time with us.
Perfect. A few more questions. I'll just continue one of Laurie's questions, follow-up questions, and I'll go to a few
Sure.
more.
Yeah.
How have CIs reacted to the feedback? A follow-up question from Laurie.
Yeah, so the most telling way I can answer that is that in subsequent SCIPAIs, instructors are incorporating feedback from previous SCIPAIs. So then I'll show you an example of this, but they'll say, hey, this week I've tried to provide feedback after each patient, as you asked on, last week, or according to the goal we set for last week. So it's neat to see them incorporating that feedback. I've really not had situations where a CI has reached out to me and said, your student thinks they're here to evaluate me instead of me evaluate them. We do try to coach our students on not creating that type of perception, but that, hey, the main gig is you're there to learn. Now, your teacher, it might be helpful. You might be able to better learn if you and your instructor have a conversation about what things could go better than they are currently going, whether it's at the beginning of the clinical or toward the end of the clinical. A great question. Thank you.
Perfect. On a similar lines, Elizabeth had a question. Did you get any pushback from the CIs to fill it out every week?
Very few CIs have pushback. Now I'll show you some of that data as well. So we were getting feedback earlier on, especially on our longer clinicals, that it seemed to be just too repetitive week after week. So on those longer clinicals, when we spaced it out, that feedback disappeared.
Perfect. And Sean, you might be covering this in the later slides, so let us know.
Yeah.
Question from Emily Hawkins. What training was provided to the students and instructors prior to their using the SCIPAI?
Yeah, so actually very little. And it was somewhat intentional because I wanted to understand, could this tool be a valid tool without a whole lot of upfront instruction? And so there was just a little bit of, here's how you use it information. The greater portion of the instruction was how to access the tool. You will see in the next section, actually, I have developed 3 different training videos, and that's actually going to be our next content. We're going to go through those videos. That will be the education piece when future users would like to use the SCIPAI. So if they would like a video, a tutorial on, well, how do I use the SCIPAI? Those user videos will be available and specific to the user, site coordinator, DCE, CI, and student.
Perfect. No more questions.
Wonderful. So yes, that leads us right to this next section. I'm going to have Kanti, if you would please go ahead and take over and share your screen and play these videos. As an introduction to these educational videos, this is going to show you the workflow for each user. They last about 5 to 6 minutes. And at times you're going to be sitting here thinking, this is going slowly. And part of it is because I can only go so fast when I'm inputting data on a form. So that's my error or slowness. But what I would like you to experience is, number one, you have some extra time to just kind of look around at the form as you're waiting for me to fill out the next item. But also you'll get to kind of a real-time sense of how long does it take to fill out this tool. Is it really only 5 minutes to fill out? So with that introduction, I'd like you, Kanti, to please go ahead and show the student workflow video.
Sure, Sean. So I'm sharing my screen. Just 1 second. Are you able to hear the audio?
Oh.
No, not yet. If you can't hear it, give it one more click. So we go back to the from the current slide in the slideshow. Great. So go to the next slide. And now click one more time on it to hear it. The student workflow for using the SCIPAI starts with logging into Exxat. Once logged in, the student selects Learning Activities and chooses the Student and Clinical Instructor Performance Assessment instrument. The SCIPAI dashboard informs the student of the status of previously completed SCIPAIs. Clicking on the Add form, the student will now open a new SCIPAI form to complete, inputting the clinical week number and the date that the student and CI will meet to discuss the SCIPAI. The student selects the clinical instructor from a drop-down list of instructors the student has previously inputted. Clicking Send triggers Exxat to send an email to the clinical instructor with a link providing access for CI completion of the SCIPAI. The student confirms this and proceeds to completing the assessment of clinical instructor and student performance for the week. First assessing clinical instructor performance, the student rates the percent of time that the clinical instructor manages supervision of the student effectively without needing cues, then provides a comment in support of the rating. The student then assesses clinical instructor feedback. The student then offers kudos or praise for something the CI did well this past week. Finally, the student offers a goal for the clinical instructor for the upcoming week. Now the student provides a self-assessment of student performance. The student provides a rating of the percentage of time the student manages evaluation, treatment, communication, and professional behaviors effectively without needing cues, and provides supporting comments for each. The student then offers self-kudos for the past week and goals for the next week. To complete the self-assessment, the student rates the percentage of the caseload the student treats independently for simple cases, complex cases, and the overall caseload. This identifies how many patients the student is completely independent in managing as a percentage of all of the patients on the CI's daily caseload. On completing the SCIPAI, the student clicks on Submit. The CI will not be able to view the student ratings and comments until the CI completes and submits the SCIPAI. Likewise, the student will not be able to view any CI ratings and comments until the student completes and submits the SCIPAI. Once both the CI and student have completed the SCIPAI, they will meet to review and discuss the completed SCIPAIs. This concludes the workflow for a student using the SCIPAI. Great, thank you, Kanti. We can just go right to the next one, which is the clinical instructor workflow. Workflow for using the SCIPAI starts with logging into Exxat. That one's the student again.
Okay.
Yep, there we go. I think just give it another click. The clinical instructor workflow to access and complete the student and clinical instructor performance assessment instrument is initiated by the student opening a new SCIPAI, triggering Exxat to send an email to the CI. Upon opening the email, the CI will click on the link provided to access the SCIPAI. The clinical instructor's SCIPAI dashboard will identify the status of previous SCIPAIs as in progress, submitted by the student, or as previously reviewed by CI and student. The CI selects the most recent SCIPAI to complete. Note that the basic information section shows data already completed by the student, assuring that the CI is completing the correct form for the correct week. For self-assessing clinical instructor performance, the CI rates the percent of time the CI manages supervision of the student effectively without needing cues, then provides a comment in support of the rating. The CI then assesses CI feedback. Next, the CI offers kudos or praise for something the CI did well this past week. Finally, the clinical instructor offers a CI goal for the upcoming week. Having completed CI self-assessment, the CI now provides assessment of student performance. The CI provides a rating of the percentage of time the student manages evaluation, treatment, communication, and professional behaviors effectively without needing cues, and provides supporting comments for each. The CI then offers student kudos for the past week. And adds goals for next week. To complete the student performance assessment, the CI rates the percentage of the caseload the student treats independently for simple cases, complex cases, and the overall caseload. This identifies how many patients the student is completely independent in managing as a percentage of all of the patients on the CI's daily caseload. Upon completing the SCIPAI, the CI clicks on Submit. The CI will not be able to view student ratings and comments until the CI completes and submits the SCIPAI. Likewise, the student will not be able to view CI ratings and comments until the student completes and submits the SCIPAI. Once both the CI and student have completed the SCIPAI, they will meet to review and discuss the completed SCIPAIs. Now that the student and CI have completed and submitted the SCIPAI, they can see each other's ratings. On this view, we have the student rating, followed by the clinical instructor rating. Student comments, clinical instructor comments. The student and clinical instructor will proceed through the SCIPAI, together looking at each other's ratings and comments and discussing where things may be similar or where there may be some differences. For example, student comments on feedback. Please provide feedback after each patient. Whereas the CI notes, hey, I provide feedback at the end of each day. So good for discussion. And it's also neat to see in times from week to week where clinical instructors will highlight and reference previous week's input, inspiring them to make changes based on that student input. This concludes the workflow for the SCIPAI for the clinical instructor. Great. So the next workflow we'll look at is the site coordinator workflow, and that's just a slide within this presentation as opposed to a video. So Kanthi, if you could just go to the next slide, and I can go off your screen for this one before we finish with the DCE workflow. So the nice thing here, it's just a slide because it's that simple for the site coordinators. As the CI does, once the student and CI complete their SCIPAIs, or when the student initiates a SCIPAI for the CI gets an email. So likewise, when the student and CI complete and submit their SCIPAIs, the site coordinator will receive an email via email, a link to access completed SCIPAIs. It's as simple as clicking on the link and reviewing the SCIPAIs. And the SCCEs have real-time access. So there may be times where they'll look at the completed SCIPAIs before the student and CI actually meet to discuss the SCIPAI, as long as the student and CI have already completed that week's SCIPAI. So now we'll go ahead to the DCE workflow, and this will be the final video. This student and clinical instructor performance assessment instrument DCE workflow tutorial will focus on DCE monitoring of SCIPAI completion and reviewing of student and clinical instructor performance. DCEs have options to review individual completed SCIPAIs for each student and to review individual and cohort data via SCIPAI data download to an Excel spreadsheet. We will take a look at each of these approaches. First, however, we will visit the SCIPAI completion dashboard. On logging into Exxat, choose Learning Activities. Next, choose the cohort of interest and the clinical education experience of interest. Now select the student and clinical instructor performance assessment form. And we have landed on the class of 2024 orthopedic clinical SCIPAI dashboard. Here we can view the status of SCIPAIs initiated by our students from in progress to review. Clicking on one of these status buttons will take it to the student's SCIPAI completion status dashboard. Clicking on the audit log shows us which actions student and CI have taken for this particular week's SCIPAI. So here the student initiated the process, completed the SCIPAI and submitted it. When the CI completed it, it changed to pending review. And once the student and CI together review it, it will change to review. Clicking on the status button for a particular SCIPAI will open that week's SCIPAI. At this point, DCEs can review student and CI ratings and comments on each CI and student performance item. I will highlight just a few of these items. CI self-reflection is showcased here. As the CI comments, while supervising, I can pause my role and tendency to get active with the patient. I can help Cameron instead learn through trial and error instead of immediately jumping in with an idea or solution. In reviewing the student performance items, I note that the CI rates the student highly, whereas the student ratings lag a little bit behind. Yet the student comments align with the CI comments, and the student notes that she's feeling good about executing differential diagnosis and post-op evaluation, as well improving the workflow and the efficiency of the evaluation. CI and student offer praises for each other in the kudos section, as well as offer goals. So here's an example of a goal for the student: be more efficient with creating the home program earlier, and the CI's goal for the student: make sure your treatment matches what is most important. Finally, the DCE can glance at the percent of cases with which the student is completely independent in managing. While still in the first half of the clinical, it appears this student is already meeting the course goal of 75% caseload independence. It also appears they may have slightly different understandings of independence and hopefully discuss this in their meeting. As a DCE reviewing a full cohort, I appreciate that each SCIPAI takes only 1 to 2 minutes to quickly review. Certainly, I spend more time if concerns appear. My workflow for reviewing each week's SCIPAIs, however, is first to download the whole cohort's completed SCIPAIs into an Excel spreadsheet. Returning to the Orthopedic Clinical SCIPAI dashboard page, I click on the icon that has an arrow coming forth from a document. A box appears identifying what data will be reported, I click on the Export button. Upon opening the Excel file, I am immediately visually overwhelmed by the amount of data, while I can see student and CI data row by row. I'm initially interested in CI assessment of self and student, and initially interested in scanning numerical ratings. So I do some sorting and coloring, while coming enhancements will group data and minimize Excel manipulations needed by the DC. It takes me just 3 to 4 minutes to sort this data. I can then scan the data for concerns in just a few minutes. Identified concerns lead me to a deeper dive into individual SCIPAI data. Let's take a quick look. I calculate averages on student and CI performance items for a reference point. These are bolded. I then sort based on student performance from highest to lowest. The light green column shows who completed the ratings in each row. I sorted to see only CI completed data first. The blue rows highlight CI supervision and feedback. The orange rows highlight student performance. Lower scores early in the clinical are not alarming, but I especially take time to determine whether the combinations of scores and comments from student and CI warrant DCE to student and/or DCE to CI communication. Finally, the caseload independence is highlighted in purple. CIs and students find this information helpful in charting progress throughout the clinical toward midterm and final summative tool item and global ratings, such as on the CPI, CIET, and PT Max. Individual SCIPAI review and downloaded data review each offer effective and complementary methods of review of completed SCIPAIs. This concludes the DCE tutorial on using the SCIPAI. Great, thank you so much, Kanthi. If you wouldn't mind giving me control of the screen again, and I will drive it from here.
Sure. Just a minute. Okay, Sean, you should be able to share your screen now.
All right, so I'm on the enhancement side. Is that what your slide? Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, that's what.
Wonderful. Wonderful, thank you. So as far as enhancements go, the first 2 bullet points just say we are trying to look at this from a visual experience as well, using color and bolding and visual spatial realignment just to make it a better visual experience for our users. The Excel download, we'll be doing some reformatting, so there are fewer steps that the DCs would need to do to be able to take a quick look at the plethora of data that comes with that download. And then in the future, we're going to be looking at week-to-week charts and tables for tracking progress. And that'll be a nice feature, especially for the students and CIs, to track their own and each other's progress. So let me just jump in and talk about the user experiences, and then we'll go ahead and open it up for questions and answers. So the SCIPAI technical experience. We rolled out the SCIPAI on Exxat to the participants of our regional study in 2022. I would say we struggled initially. We had about 10 to 25% had access issues. Very gratefully, those were resolved pretty quickly, but it's still a hassle for your students and CIs that they don't want to have to put up with. So the 2023 experience for UD, we've had 144 clinicals, only 4 access issues, 3 of which immediately were resolved. 1 student ended up using a fillable PDF version of the SCIPAI. So we're very grateful for Exxat's work to minimize technical interruptions and access issues. The student experience. So this is from internal data. This is not what I would call a research study caliber collection of data, but it's what we have currently. So 108 students on a 5-point scale. said, I made changes in performance based on the SCIPAI. So most students are identifying, giving it a 4.3 out of 5 rating that, yeah, the SCIPAI is helping me make changes. And likewise, a similar, above 4 rating for does my CI make changes based on the SCIPAI, use of the SCIPAI. So good news there. The most common remark, I mentioned this earlier from students, is that it's just nice to have a record of their progress throughout the clinical. And that may be, some students don't always get pats on the backs from their CIs, but the SCIPAI really helps in the absence of lots of kudos to mark their progress throughout the clinical. Students certainly identified they like using the regular SCIPAIs instead of a midterm CPI on those shorter clinicals, and 5 to 10 minutes to complete. Students tend to land more around 10 minutes. There's others who take longer, and they understand that that's their own prerogative because they want to be more detailed than just a phrase or two per each item. So clinical instructors. So of 83 surveyed, 56 of them, or 68%, said the tool is helpful or very helpful. Another 16% were neutral. And then only 13% identified that the SCIPAI was not too helpful or not helpful at all. And when we did receive comments along with those ratings, the comments tended to be that the CIs were already doing all of those things before they had the SCIPAI available. So they just felt it was a redundant, and now they have to document what they were already doing verbally, perhaps. The CIs on subsequent SCIPAIs self-assess and comment based on previous SCIPAIs. I love this, and it really, I've been really impressed at clinical instructors' self-assessment. The majority of them really seem to take it seriously and as an opportunity to reflect and improve, and we see that. So, and certainly CIs as well as students enjoy the not having to fill out a midterm summative assessment. Time-wise, CIs attest to the same timeframes that I previously discussed. So for me, though, this is, we designed the tool for the student in the CI. It is a bonus that I have extra perks because of the use of the tool, but I really feel it's made my job easier. So of the 144 clinicals per year, we have 12 to 18 students now reaching out, usually early in the clinical, and just saying, hey, help me find the words to express this concern to my CI. And we are just jazzed about that because it tells us our students are stepping up and saying, hey, we are buying into this culture of conversation. We need to be able to have conversations with our CIs. We know that down the road when we have supervisors or coworkers that we don't necessarily agree with or feel it's appropriate to critique, we got to be able to have those skills. So they're reaching out and developing those skills. As far as problematic clinicals, 1 to 5 of our clinicals require DCE to CI, SEC communications for more heavy issue resolution. And I don't know what the data is for other schools, but we're pleased that we're at that very low end, considering 144 clinicals per year. I've identified this culture of professional critical conversation, and I really think that's one of the greatest bonuses of using the SCIPAI. It meets the CI's desire for feedback for improving as a clinical instructor during the clinical that they're currently instructing. And I've highlighted numerous times just more touch points with the student in CI. So I'll close just with the slide that you saw at the beginning. These are the benefits of this tool. It's a formative tool. It helps give snapshots for performance improvement throughout a clinical. We're assessing student and clinical instructor performance with self and other assessment with the benefit of both ratings and supporting comments. It does demonstrate validity. It's readily accessible, not just to the student CI, but also the site coordinator and DCE. And then it's nationally available on a common database with abundant research potential. So I will leave it at that, and really thank you for your time today, and I'd be happy to answer any other questions you may have. Oh, here's the references. If you want to see those in print, I did refer to each of those references earlier in the slideshow. But yeah, Kunal, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. Yes. So 2 questions from Laurie. One is, does the CI get a notification when all the parties have completed the SCIPAI so they can see student feedback?
Would you please repeat that?
Does the CI get a notification when all the parties have completed the SCIPAI so they can see the student feedback?
No, but they immediately have access to both. So in the video that I showed you on the DCA workflow, I was acting as the clinical instructor. As soon as I completed the SCIPAI, and the student had already completed it, it just automatically showed up on my screen, updated my view with the student's input right next to mine. But there's
Perfect.
not a separate queue to say, hey, student and CI have completed it.
Okay, another question.
The DCEs can see that progress on the DCE view of Exxat. Yeah.
Perfect. One more question from Laurie, Sean.
Yes.
There are many SCCEs that are not on site or are not heavily involved in daily interactions at the site level. Is there a possibility that it not be sent to the SCCE?
Yeah, that's a technical question, Kunal, that you and I would have to explore. It's I think the site coordinators have either been grateful or they've just ignored the emails that they're getting, because I've not really gotten strong feedback one way or the other.
Got it. Perfect. A few more questions.
Yeah.
2 from Ellie. Is there same thing? Okay. Same thing as Laurie. Is there a way to opt in or out for the SCCE email? I'm thinking of my SCCEs that are more administrative than clinical in focus. So same question as Laurie. There are 2. And then second question from Emily. Have you encountered any instances where the site has their own weekly form they want to use? I can think of 2 to 3 of ours that do that. If you did, how did you navigate that?
Yeah, so when that occurs, I tell the students, just have a dialogue with the CI, look at both forms and see what you feel would be most beneficial. Even if they have their own form, I still have as a requirement for our students that they need to fill out the SCIPAI unless they have something they can provide to me where they're providing self-reflection and assessment of clinical instructor performance. So it's very rare that I actually have this discussion. Our clinical sites have pretty readily accepted the tool as a replacement for their own in virtually all cases. Occasionally I'll have, one student a year say, hey, our site really wants to use their form. And I said, that's fine. Let's just make sure that I have a way of understanding that you are providing self and clinical instructor assessment throughout the clinical.
Perfect. One question from Janine Smith. Does the SCCE have to review the SCIPAI before the form is accessible to DCE for review?
No, the site coordinator is really just has the option of looking at the form if they'd like. They never have to click on the email if they don't want to look at it. And it doesn't have any factor in student CI or DCE accessibility for viewing completed results.
Got it. Perfect. All right. One more question from Emily. SCIPAI is formative, so there aren't any form benchmarks. Do you give any guides on scoring or expect everyone to know their understanding of A, B, and C grading scales?
Yeah, so I don't necessarily give any benchmarking ahead of time, but at the end of a week when I review the SCIPAIs for that week, I might give just a quick summary and say, hey, most of our students were rated between 50 and 75% overall caseload independence this week. But I'll also preface that with, this is just to give you context. This is not saying that this is a standard that if you fall out of this range, it's problematic. You know, if it's problematic that someone's not performing where they should be, I'll be in communication with them. And sometimes I'll use kind of that generic email to the whole cohort, students and CIs, and say, you know, I've reached out to you if I've seen something concerning. If you've not heard from me and I'm missing something, please let me know. If you have concerns, please let me know.
Okay, perfect. And then one last question, maybe I can answer this also, from Elizabeth Chaffin. Is this
Sure.
only available on the Prism version? I believe this tool is available on version 3 also, Sean. We actually, is that correct? I believe so.
That's where we started.
Yeah.
You know, as enhancements have been made, I don't know what's been continued on version 3 because I'm on version 4, so I don't look there anymore.
Right. So I think the latest and greatest, Elizabeth, is on Prism right now, the version 4. So I think most of you either are on version 4 Prism or are in the process of being transitioned this year to Prism. So that will be the latest and greatest version where we'll support the SCIPAI and the reports. Okay, at this point, I see no more questions in the queue. Sean, I think we are good to go then.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody again for your attendance, and certainly reach out if you have questions, and I wish you the best as you start your new school year.
Perfect. Again, thank you again, Sean, for hosting the webinar today. Very, very informative as usual. I believe we have one last few announcements, Kanti, correct?
Yes, yes. Yeah. Thank you, Sean. I think okay, that's it. Thank you, Sean, for the presentation. And that brings us to the end of this webinar. If you have a few minutes, we would love to hear from you. So please stick around once the webinar ends for a short survey to let us know how we did today and what can be improved. And also please let us know if there are any additional topics you would like to see in the future. Okay, with that, thank you once again, everyone, for joining the webinar, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.